Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the book show that began the day of lockdown when authors' tours, mine included, were all canceled. Bookstore doors were shuttered. Readers couldn't get, to have conversations with their favorite authors. And we're going on our fifth year now. So we're kind of like going into kindergarten. We've passed the terrible twos and the toddler stage. And I'm like terrifically excited today because we have one of my favorite authors. And we've been talking before in the green room, which really isn't green. And he's very funny and just a stupendous author, Garth Greenwell. And his book, Small Rain, is just exquisite, absolutely exquisite. So before I talk about it, just a few housekeeping things for people. On the right, I've made it easy for you in the chat. Buy books at independent bookstores. I've given you all the link right to Garth's books, so you can go and you can order all of them. They're all completely wonderful. Or bookshop.org will tell you where the nearest indie bookstore is, so you can get the books there. If you have questions, don't be shy. Really, don't be shy at all. Put them in the chat, and I will ask them. So let me give Garth the introduction he deserves. Let me just pull this up because there's no way I could have memorized it. Garth Greenwell is the author of What Belongs to You, which won the British Book Award for Debut of the Year, was longlisted for the National Book Award, and was a finalist for 6 other awards. His second book of fiction, Cleanness, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and was longlisted for the Gordon Byrne Prize, the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. It was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2020, a New York Times Critics Top 10 Book of the Year, and the Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker, Time, NPR, the BBC, and over 30 other publications. He's the co-editor with R.O. Kwan of the anthology Kink, which was named a New York Times Notable Book. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, the Paris Review, A Public Space, every place. He writes regularly about literature, film, art, and music for his Substack, To a Green Thought, and everybody should go subscribe to that. He's a recipient of many honors, including the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2020. Small Rain is his latest book, and it's absolutely extraordinary. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it and read some of the praise, and then I'll shut up and we'll let Garth talk. Small Rain is about an unnamed narrator who has a terrifying medical experience. But during that experience, all sorts of different things are going on too. He's having meditations about what it means to be healthy, what it means to be dying, what it means to be living, what it means to be in a relationship or out of a relationship. There are thoughts about sex and renovating a home and just that weird geography of being in a hospital. So I want to say welcome so much, Garth. I'm so happy you're here. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, okay, so my first question is, wait, I forgot to read some of the prize. Sorry. Washington Post says, profound, daring, mysterious, audacious. Chicago Review says, prismatic in the ways it reflects our collective values of love and art and new life. It's a triumph of genuine vulnerability. The Atlantic says, Garth Greenwell is unafraid to depict plainly what often goes unspoken. His sentences transform the clinical narration of a hospital stay into the soothing murmur of a prayer. And in The New Yorker, Small Rain is not a book about the hospital or the medical system. However, it unfurls internally in the consciousness of a character, a consciousness aware of itself evolving, shaped by a terrible new pain and knowledge, an exquisite addition to the literature of illness. Okay, so after all that praise, here's my first question. Okay, one of the rave reviews commented on your ability to, quote unquote, think the body onto the page. And I think that's true, because I want to say that you don't just read Small Rain, you inhabit it. I mean, I felt it in my body as I was reading. What does that mean to you to think the body onto the page? And was that a conscious choice, or did it just happen?
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. I'm so glad that was your experience of the book. I mean, I do think like my project in all three of my books so far has been to try to put on the page what it feels like to be an embodied consciousness. So
Mhm.
I'm interested in thinking, I'm interested in how the mind works. I mean, I sort of think the real subject of all my books, whatever they seem to be about, is like how we make meaning out of existence, like how we are meaning making animals. But something I talk about a lot with my students is that it is impossible to represent consciousness without representing the body.
Right.
And representing the body means not just sort of like our sensory apparatus and all of the stuff that we're taking in all the time, like the data we're taking in through our senses, but like also bodies are situated. Bodies are situated in particular places and particular historical moments and political realities and in communities and surrounded by other bodies. And so there's a way in which, I guess I think finally it is always about attentiveness, like this particular sort of heightened pitch of attentiveness, and
Right.
then trying to put that attention on the page.
It's interesting that you said heightened because that's exactly the way you feel. I mean, I had heard about the style before I started reading the book, and I thought, I wonder how that's going to work because you break a lot of rules. There's big blocks of paragraphs, no quote marks, some stream of consciousness, not a lot of dialogue. But the thing is, by page 2, I was so immersed, there could have been a fire drill outside my room, and I wouldn't have heard it. It's just, it works perfectly for the book, and it's more immersive than just about any other book I've read recently. And I wanted to know again, was this a conscious decision, or did it just seem like the right way to do this book, or did it just come
Yeah,
out?
I mean, in some ways, I think it's kind of the tradition that I'm working out of, sort of the tools that I have. It's funny, I'm teaching this semester, the seminar I'm teaching is on Henry James, who's
Oh,
probably
great.
the English language writer who's been most important to me. And one of the things that I've been marveling about, like you mentioned, these sort of blocks of text, these long paragraphs, and that's a very Jamesian device. And what I love about James's paragraphs is that they're immersive in the way you say, and also that they feel like a kind of adventure. They're not sort of punctuating thoughts, they're not punctuating actions, but the way that a character or a character's consciousness will begin in one place at the beginning of a paragraph, and then a page, 2 pages, 2.5 pages later, be somewhere different. And you feel that they really have undergone something, so that the paragraph becomes a kind of dramatic unit. And that's really appealing to me. And I do think about that. And I do want my books to be immersive. So I'm really happy that was your experience.
This one was absolutely immersive. It was hypnotic. It was one of those books where, as I was getting to the end, I was thinking, "Oh shoot, it's the book is going to end. This is really bad." I wanted to also ask you about the book is not autobiographical, but you did have a medical experience similar to the terrifying one the narrator goes through. There are some biographical elements, and of course, there is an Iowa City hospital. So, my first question is, was it disturbing to go back into some of those memories and relive that, because it's very, very alive on the page? And the second question was, did the experience feel differently writing about it than having just have it in your memory or talking about it?
Yeah, I am a writer who, like, the reason I feel compelled to write a book is that there is something either in my experience or in sort of my immediate vicinity that I feel just totally overwhelmed and bewildered by. And this experience of undergoing this health crisis totally out of the blue, sort of being struck down in a way similar to what the narrator undergoes, that was an utterly bewildering experience. I felt unmoored and kind of disoriented in my own life. And so writing the book, even though the book is full of invention and transforms things, it is
Yes.
not a transcript of my experience. It
No.
was a way of trying to process that experience. And there's a way, it was really difficult. And, part of the research for the book was watching all of these nursing videos. I wanted to get like
Oh,
the texture of hospital existence right, and I wanted to get like the logistics of these medical procedures right. And so I watched just a ton of nursing training videos. Those are terrifying because, of course, they talk about all the things that can go wrong and like how often, and putting in an arterial line, and they say, oh, if this happens, it means you've ruptured the artery on the other side and gone too far, and here's what you do. And I mean, that was so harrowing just to realize. I mean, of course, people make mistakes all the time, or bodies are weird and they
yeah.
aren't shaped, an artery isn't shaped the way it's supposed to be. And so just all of the ways that things can go wrong. It was kind of harrowing, yeah, to sort of
Yeah, but you got
revisit
it
that.
exactly right. Even describing some of the instruments they use that you never think of. I mean, I can remember when I was in the hospital, they came in with this big thing that looked like a trowel. It was rubber, and that's what they weigh you on. They put
Yeah,
you on it
right,
like a meat scale. It's
right.
it's a very strange experience. So I want to talk about, there's so much of real importance in the book. It's about what it means. It isn't really just about what it means to be sick. It's much more about what does it mean to have a loving partner, and what does it mean
Mhm.
to build a home. And the thing is, while the narrator is sort of, his body is breaking apart, these other things are coming to the surface, and we feel the narrator's partner is called Elle, and we feel the love and the ebb and flow of that relationship, which is so incredibly moving. We also feel all the details about renovating a house, which is also, I mean, I've renovated a house and it's a nightmare on wheels. But it's making another new thing. And I just loved the way all of this progressed. And I always want to ask writers, when you start out to write something, sometimes you think you know what you're writing about, and then when you finish it and you look at the revision, you think, oh my God, I thought I was writing about this, but I was really writing about that. Does that happen to you? And if so, what were you really writing about? What were you writing about before you realized what you were writing about in Small Rain?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of anxiety for me starting the book. For one thing, I mean, this is the first book that I began sitting down and thinking, I'm going to write a novel. My first two books, I really tricked myself into writing book length works of fiction. Those are novels that are in pieces. I mean, my first book, I really never thought of it as a novel until it was almost finished. And so there was a way that it was also the first fiction I had
Wow.
ever written. And so, I called what I was doing every morning. I was working as a high school teacher in Sofia, Bulgaria, and I would wake up at 4:30 in the morning to write for 2 hours. And I thought of it as writing sentences. And there's a way, I'm so grateful that I did that, because if I had thought I'm going to write a novel, I would have been totally paralyzed. And I felt some of that anxiety sitting down this time and sort of knowing, okay, I'm going to begin a book and I'm going to keep writing this book for years until I finish this novel. And I knew that I had kind of the backbone or the coat, I don't know what the metaphor is, of the hospital stay, which was really
Right, right.
helpful. I knew that there were certain things that were going to happen over these days that he was in the hospital, although the number of days changed. I didn't know exactly how many days. But as you say, I mean, that's what the novel is about, but also it's not what the novel is about.
Right.
And really, what happens, I mean, this is a guy, he's entering middle age. Um, I think he has become, my first two books, it's the same narrator. And in the first two books, it's really important to him to think of his life as an adventure. He lives in
Right,
Eastern Europe. He's having geographical adventures. He's
right,
very attached to erotic adventure. And
right,
in this book, he's 7 years into a long-term relationship, living in Iowa City, splitting a mortgage on a house.
right.
There's a way in which I think his life seems like the opposite of adventure. And like maybe a lot of people entering middle age, I think he has kind of become, like not in any catastrophic way. He's not super unhappy, but like maybe a little disappointed by his life, and certainly a little dulled to his life. Like he's not really seeing his life anymore. And what happens at the beginning of the book when he is struck down by this annihilating pain, when his life is taken away from him and he's put in this ICU bed, that and one of the first things he's told in the ER by one of the surgeons, he's told, you could die from this.
Oh
And
God.
so, you know, I mean, that like flash, that like, I think of it as almost like an atomic flash of mortality. In some way, you know, it takes his life away from him. Literally, he's stuck in this bed. But in another way, it gives his life back to him because
That's
it
right.
lights up his life for him. And so there's a way that mortality puts everything under pressure. And like, really, I do think this is a book that's kind of about everything, you know, as you say. I mean, it makes him recognize how cherishable
Yep.
his relationship is. It makes
Yep.
him recognize how sort of bound he is to this existence, and how much actually this existence, which he has thought of as the opposite of adventure, actually domesticity, you know, long intimacy with another
Mhm.
person, day by day, getting that itself is an adventure, you know, and it's an adventure he wants to keep having.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. You've been called by some critics a sensualist as a compliment, but I wanted to ask you, don't you think that's just paying attention to everything around you? Isn't that just what it is?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
good. I'm
I
glad you
really
said
agree with
yes.
that. I really agree with that. You know, I mean, there are all sorts of ways to write books, and like
Right.
anything, like art is always bigger than anything we can say about it. But as I say, I mean, my particular project is like trying to get what existence feels like onto the page. And
Right.
that does mean, you know, I mean, I feel so much, especially, you know, the past 3 years I've spent in New York, and especially here in New York City, where there is such sensory overload. I feel like as a survival mechanism, much of the time, I'm shutting down my
Right.
sensorium as much as I
Right.
can. And, you know, art is a space where you open that up. And I think when we shut down our sensorium, I think we are shutting down an awful lot of our humanness. And so to be able, I mean, art can restore that to us, you know, can restore that sort of vividness, that aliveness of perception.
Totally agree. Totally agree. You said something interesting before about, how you were anxious starting to write this book. And I think this is something really important for all the writers out there to hear, that somebody can be as critically acclaimed and award winning and respected and honored as you, and still feel anxiety when you
Oh,
sit down to
oh
write.
yeah. Oh,
It
I mean,
doesn't get easier.
it really doesn't. You know, I like to say this thing. I gave a commencement speech several years ago at Bennington for their MFA students, and one of the themes of my little speech was that the content changes, but the anxiety remains the same.
I
Like,
love that.
you know, you think that there are like these milestones that, you know, at some point, and I mean, I don't know, you know, I've only written 3 books. Like maybe this feels different. I mean, you've written more books than I have. Maybe this feels different further along, but like
No, it
I
doesn't.
feel, yeah, I mean, I sort of feel like always, if you are really making art, you don't know what you're doing, and you are kind of staring into an abyss. And every artist, every serious artist I know, and also reports from the artists I revere, when you start a new project, you don't know anything. You know, there's a way in which I'm skeptical of ideas, and I say this as someone who teaches in an MFA program, but I'm skeptical of ideas of technique, because it seems to me that, like, you know, what craft is like a tool that you invent in response to a particular problem, and you don't necessarily get to carry it with you. You know, it's not
Right,
necessarily going to be the tool you need, and each book is going to present new problems that
right,
require new tools. And so that sense of like, I never know if I'm going to be able to finish a book. You know, I never know if something's going to work. So that anxiety, you have to find a way to sort of accept that anxiety as part of the cost of sort of this enormous privilege of getting to make my life around doing this thing that I love, and that sort of lights up my life with meaning.
thank you so much for saying that. It just thank you so, so much. I want to talk about, you have this essay that I absolutely loved, which was about moral obsession, which caused some controversy, and I don't know why, but in the essay, you talk about that art doesn't have to have responsibilities. In, for example, we can write from the viewpoint of, say, a serial killer without having to condemn the killer, or let the audience know that certainly we don't side with the killer. We're writing about it. And, I'm bringing this up because in my last book, I wrote about a rape, and the copy editor said, well, you want to make sure that the reader doesn't think you approve of it. So maybe you should. And I just, my head sort of exploded. But anyway, you were talking about how we should acknowledge possibility, because that's what art should do. I would love for you to talk about that moral obsession essay, because it's phenomenal. And actually, it's online. I believe if people want to read it, I should have put the link up here. But you can just Google it and you can read it. It's great. So please talk about it.
Yeah. So this is an essay about Philip Roth's, I think, very great novel, Sabbath Theater, and it was published in the Yale Review. And I was interested because this is a novel that is really about a guy who does a lot of awful things. And certainly a guy you would not want to spend a lot of time with, a guy who does really unforgivable things in the course of the novel. And at the end of the novel, you have not been tempted to excuse anything he's done. You don't feel like, oh, you'd like to go have a beer with this guy or invite him into your house. But you do, after 500 pages in his company, you do cherish his existence. And that is a very powerful feeling, to sort of feel that you cherish the existence of someone you can't stand. Seems to me like a real moral education.
Yeah.
And, I do think that the fundamental, or kind of the only responsibility of the artist is to be interested in human beings, and to want to look at human beings and to try to sort of, I think of it as like doing research into the human. We are trying to discover things about what it means to be a human being. And I do think that the greatest art, I think the relationship between art and morality is so complicated, because I do think that art has a kind of moral purpose. I do think art helps us to live. But I think in order for art to have that moral purpose, we have to protect it from all moral programs and all moralisms, and the idea that you have to broadcast your judgment of a character you're writing about, like the idea instead being, that actually judgment, like deciding whether someone is good or bad, one is beyond the possibility of the human, because other people are kind of infinitely unknowable. We can never have enough context to really pass judgment on a human being. But also that's such an impoverished kind of knowledge. And if we're doing research into the human, there are just much more interesting ways to think about people than sorting them into sort of categories of good, bad, mixed. I just don't think that's the novelist's job at all.
I don't either. What do you think about, there's a tendency in publishing now, which people say writers should stay in their own lane, which is something that I personally don't believe. I believe if you dig deep enough and you have understanding and you do your research, you should be okay. But I kind of think that I know what you're going to say, but I want you to say it anyway. So what do you feel about that? Do you feel like writers should be able to write about whatever they want, or with caveats maybe?
Yeah, actually without caveats. I think nobody gets to tell an artist what she should make, end of story. And what an artist should make is what she feels compelled to make. And I just sort of, as a human being, there are just examples of books. I think of a very controversial book that people, including gay men, have really widely different views on. But a book like A Little Life.
A Little Life. My son just read it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's 28 years old and he was devastated.
Did he like it? Did he hate it?
He loved it. He loved it. Loved it.
I loved it too. But I understand, I respect people who hate it, that's fine. But Hanya Yanagihara is not a gay man or a man who has...
That's right.
There's a way in which gay is kind of a controversial thing to say about the book, but it is a book about men whose emotional and erotic lives are organized around other men. That is not true of Hanya Yanagihara. I felt about that book that book was a profound revelatory inhabitation of the lives of men whose lives are affectively and erotically organized around other men. And like that to me, and other examples of books like that, or, you know, a sort of identity that I can't claim for myself, but I just finished teaching Portrait of a Lady, which I think is one of the most profound inhabitations of a human being I know. And so I cannot bear any theory of the human that says that our imagination is so impoverished that it like hits up against a wall when it attempts to imagine across certain, let us acknowledge, pretty arbitrarily selected categories of identity. I don't think identity is fixed in that way. I don't think identity is essentialist in that way. Now, I do think that can go wrong in lots of ways. Like everything else in art can go wrong. And of course, we're going to constantly fail our attempt to imagine into the lives of other people. You know, I come from a place, I was raised in the pre-internet American South, where when I was being raised, the only stories I ever heard about gay men were that we could molest children and we could die of AIDS. So, you know, those were not stories that were being told to me that were written by gay men themselves.
Right,
so it is not a contradiction to sort of absolutely believe in the importance of own voices representation, of diversifying the kinds of voices that have audiences, and saying, of course, like through a labor of, you know, craft and research, and also a labor of love. I mean, an attempt to sort of imagine yourself into solidarity, kind of empathetic solidarity with a person who is unlike you. Like, of course it is possible for art to do that. I can't bear any philosophy of the human, any vision of human beings that says that that's closed off to us.
I agree. You have a few comments, not questions, but comments. So thank you, people. Ellen Comazor says, greetings from Delray Beach. I've followed your career since you came to Rochester with your debut. That's great. Oh. Robin Stahl says, hello all from Idaho. And she also, yeah, that's what she said, hello all from Idaho. Okay, so I have another question for you about music and art, because you said something really interesting where when you're looking over a novel, revising it, sometimes you would say, you know what, there's a note missing or there's a chord missing. I loved that. And I felt like I knew what you meant in my gut, but I would love for you to talk about it more.
Well, you know, I mean, it is just how I think about structure. And I think it's just because of my education. You know, I mean, I was not raised in a cultural household. My family were tobacco farmers. I was the first generation raised off the farm. I did not grow up in a house full of books. And what sort of saved me when I was 14 years old and a really lost gay kid in Kentucky public schools was a choir teacher, a choir director in my public school in Louisville, who heard something in my voice and started giving me voice lessons after school. You know, he was the first adult who had ever treated me as though my life might have value. And he gave me my first, you know, I realized the other day I was saying my first opera CDs, but they were cassette tapes, my first cassette tapes of opera. Wow. And he also gave me tickets to the Kentucky Opera. You know, he just set me on this course, and music would be the thing that kind of lifted me out of that life where I think I was, you know, destined not to be around very long, really, and placed me on this course of music. And so all of my education in narrative, because I didn't study fiction until after I finished What Belongs to You. I had never taken a fiction workshop. Wow. I had never studied fiction as a scholar. You know, I studied poetry for a long time and did graduate work in poetry. But before that, my experience of narrative was opera. You know, and my experience of sort of how you shape an emotional experience across time and aesthetic experience was music. And so I remember so clearly, I remember even talking about this with people as I was coming to the end of What Belongs to You. And I knew that, I knew how the book was going to end, but I also knew there was something that was missing that wasn't about the plot. Like, it wasn't like the cause and consequence of plot. There wasn't something missing in character development, etc. but there was a chord missing. Like there was a harmonic progression was missing a chord. And I remember when I discovered the second to last scene in that book is this long scene where the narrator is on a train and he's just like watching this boy, this little kid with his grandmother sort of playing on this train journey. And I remember my relief when I found that scene, because I knew that that was the chord it needed. Again, you could take that out and the story is the same, but the experience of the novel would be ruined. And that is, it's just the way I think about structure is musical,
Right.
because that was my early experience of structure.
It's great and it makes sense. Tell us about what you call a neurotic close reading.
Oh yeah. So, so because I am an educator, I think a lot about what it means to get an aesthetic education and like how we learn to be better artists. And I'm actually, again, even though I teach in an MFA program, I myself have 2 MFAs. I did an MFA in my early 20s in poetry and then in my mid 30s in fiction. I'm skeptical of workshop as a place where we really learn to be better writers. I think workshop can be helpful. I think it can be meaningful. I think it's meaningful in terms of community and in terms of finding helpful readers and, having people help you to see your work more clearly. But I really think where we learn to be writers is in this profound sort of contact with and encounter with art that seems to us great.
Yes.
And for me, what that encounter looks like, and this is actually the kind of classes that I love to teach. I'm doing this in my Henry James class here at NYU, and then I'm about to, we haven't announced this, but I'm about to announce a year-long series of online courses on Henry James, sort of classes for writers. And it is, I think like neurotic close reading, where like you take a sentence, you take a paragraph, and you just try to see everything you can see in it. That is a way of trying to enter into the choices that a writer has made, many of them unconscious choices. These are the things, like as an artist, our job is to like fiddle and fiddle and fiddle and fiddle until it feels right. And then as readers, like we don't need to know why it feels right. In fact, I try not to know why it feels right. I try to shut down this part of my intelligence when I'm drafting, because I think like making art comes from, these urges that we don't really fully understand.
Right.
But our sense of what has been right, of what is right, our sense of what gives us aesthetic pleasure, that is trained through hours and hours and hours and years and years and years of apprenticeship to art that seems to us great. And that apprenticeship takes the shape of this, what I call neurotic close reading. And that's, that's what I love doing. I think that that's actually really helpful. And to writers as a way, and hopefully these Henry James classes, I hope that they will serve as a model for then how students or how writers can encounter other artists and other writers who are sort of, their most beloved writers.
Well, I think it gives you a version of what's possible. I mean, it was just like my reading your pages and pages through blocks and realizing this is really fantastic. This is really like, how did he do that? And then you go back and you look at it and it's really, really freeing to realize that there's a lot of things that are possible. So I have to ask you, what's the worst advice anybody's ever given you about writing?
So I actually have a very clear, distinct answer to that.
Oh, good.
And it's from my poetry years. It's actually from a poetry workshop. So I was 22 or something, and I had written this long poem, which I am sure was not very good. It was like inspired by Foucault, and it was about S&M, and I was trying to write sex. In some ways, things that I've continued to think about. But basically, it was a philosophical poem about sadomasochistic sex. And my teacher said, you cannot have a thinking S&M. And I just thought, you can't have any other kind. Like, what are you talking about? But, this is something that has been echoed in it's funny, people don't really say this anymore. But at the beginning of my career, when people were first encountering my work, it's funny. I wonder if like I've sort of beaten down the resistance in some way just by being stubborn. But people would say like people don't think like this when they're having sex, and I would just think, well, maybe you don't.
Maybe they do. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And it may be, you know, the particular kinds of sex I was having, you know, cruising and back rooms and all of that. But it seems to me that like sex is one of the experiences, and it's actually not just those particular experiences. Because when I think of great writing of sex, like Mary McCarthy in The Group, when she writes Dottie losing her virginity to a poet who has a fiance, like it's so many bad choices. But that is an amazing physical experience that is productive of so much thinking on her part.
Yep.
So, but that was really bad advice that I got.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Okay, so here's a companion question that I always ask, because obviously I'm the most obsessive person on earth. What's obsessing you now and why? Bonus points if it's not the election, of course, because of course it's the election. But beside that,
it is the election. But actually, you know, the thing that I hate about publishing a book is that that becomes your obsession for the weeks that you are on tour, for the weeks that you're, you know, and now I've been on tour for like 6 weeks. My first events were at the end of August. And like, I am so tired of like so much of my brain being taken up by myself and by my own work. You know, I feel desperate to like get back to my desk and be thinking about other things and be thinking about other works of art. And so Henry James, I'm obsessed with right now because I'm teaching this class. And then I'm also obsessed. So my next book will be a book of essays, and the last essay I have to write for that book is on Saint Augustine. And so I'm desperate to get back to being obsessed with Henry James and Saint Augustine, and hopefully soon.
So I have my last question. Actually, is one that it was the weirdest question that somebody asked me, and then I thought, well, this would be fun to ask Garth. What do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun? Oh, well, actually, like art. Like so, you know, I moved to New York a couple of years ago, and like immediately just sort of glutted myself. This is actually why I started a Substack, because, you know, I just immediately like threw myself into going to the opera, going to the symphony. You know, Iowa City is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful place, but it doesn't have an opera. It doesn't have a symphony. It didn't, when the museum was destroyed in a flood in 2008, and it only reopened, a new building reopened actually right after I left for New York City. So I had been all that time without a museum. So my like fun for me is like going to the cinema, going to a museum, going to the opera, going to the symphony, like that. I love that. And that's a really wonderful thing about New York.
It is the wonderful thing of New York. I once had a boyfriend who said, you know what's wrong with you? All you want to do is go to the movies, read, go to museums. And I remember saying, there's a problem with that? How?
Perfect. That's perfect. That's all I want to do is have art experiences. That's actually all I want to do.
Me too. So I want to tell everybody out there, thank you for being here. Thank you for the ones who posted comments. Don't forget, bookshop.org. So easy to remember. You can just order your books right now as soon as you get off. And seriously, small writing is just, it's important, it's profound, it will change you, which is what the best art does. So please read it. And if you read it, you know, like email me, because I'm obsessed with the book and I'm happy to talk about it with you. So we'll see all of you next week. Garth, you stay on because I need to thank you privately. And also, this is going to live on YouTube, so you can watch it again. You can post comments again. You can tell your friends. And it will be a podcast in a few months, so you can listen to it that way too. Thank you all so much. We'll see you all next week. And Garth, I'll see you in 1 second.